Everyone. Welcome aboard. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, whatever your time zone. Welcome aboard. This is Digital Transformation Talk. I am your host, Kevin Crane. Welcome to the show. Digital transformation. Well, look, companies and organizations everywhere are looking to adopt new technology-driven tools and approaches so they can gain an advantage. Often this means new ways of working, new ways of managing employees, new ways of managing technology, and new ways of serving customers. So how are we doing this? How are they doing this? Well, many companies are making bigger moves to the cloud, e-commerce, digital supply chains, things like artificial intelligence and data analytics, and a host of other areas that can deliver efficiency and innovation. But all of this can be risky. The same digital initiatives that create new opportunities can create big risks like security breaches or compliance failures or other expensive high-tech setbacks. And the result is an ongoing conflict between the need to innovate and the need to mitigate risk. And that's what we're here today to talk about. Why enterprises need to manage risk differently and how they can make the most of their efforts while really moving the needle when it comes to digital innovation and process improvement and performance. Excuse me. But how do we define this risk? What are the top risks that we should be concerned about? Well, first is an operational risk, the risk to the operation itself. Disparate or inconsistent application of technology, especially when not adequately tied to business objectives, can cause us to miss the mark when it comes to real business impact. The second is cybersecurity and regulatory risk. Changes in systems and technologies may lead to increased cyber risks and increased risk of non-compliance. Things like data security and hacking and insider risk, cybercrime are all generally becoming more acute. And any inconsistencies moving away from legacy data security and information governance can lead to undiscovered issues that may linger, unknown to CISOs and technologists and the board. Another big risk is financial. Look, none of these digital transformation initiatives are free. Investments are often heavy, but can often fail to achieve their intended returns. Errors in technology, either during the conversion or the implementation process or later on, with systems that may not be aligned with business objectives, can all result in financial losses that can have a real impact on the bottom line, especially if your competitors do it right while you struggle. And finally, strategic risk. Digital transformation can give you a competitive edge, but missteps can be tragic. We only need to think back to big, successful brands that we used to know, like Radio Shack or Kodak or Blockbuster, AOL or Toys R Us. These were all organizations that were slow to change technologically and in the eyes of the market, and today are now all but forgotten. So what can we do to reduce these risks and others with our digital transformation initiatives and strategies? That's what we'll be exploring in today's program. And I have some great guests that I want to introduce in just a second, as well as a news item to start us off. But I do want to hear from you too. I'd like to encourage everyone attending today to participate. You may participate and participate. So please join us with your comments in the chat section. And if you have a question along the way for our guests, please enter them into the Q&A feature, and I will attempt to get some of those into the flow of the show. And we'll have a few minutes at the end also for questions. All right, with all of that said, let's bring our guest panel on board today, starting with Jay Goldman. Jay is the co-founder of Sensei Labs and the author of the book, The Decoded Company. Jay, welcome aboard. Where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from Toronto today, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Toronto, a beautiful, beautiful city. Jay is also joined by Jonathan Alloy. Jonathan is the Vice President of Customer Experience and Innovation Consulting at Publicis Sapient. Jonathan, are you with us? Hello, Jonathan.
I am with you, calling in from New York City.
New York City, oh yes, the capital of the world. Welcome aboard. And now, finally, Shreyas Becker. Shreyas is Director of Global AI and Data Products for Industrial Affairs at Sanofi. Shreyas, are you with us? Welcome aboard. Where are you calling in from? Shreyas, are you with us? We can see Shreyas, but we cannot hear you. Welcome aboard. All right. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll have you work with Hunter in the background, see if we can't resolve your audio issues, Shreyas. So please stand by for more. But Jay and Jonathan, while we're waiting for Shreyas to come on board and get his microphone straightened out, I would like to point us to an article published recently by Gartner. And I believe that is should be in the chat feature here in the side for all of us to take a look at. But look, this Gartner article, there it is. This Gartner article summarizes some key findings from the Gartner 2023 Board of Directors survey. And the survey included 281 board directors and members of various boards across different industries and geographies. And among other things, the study aims to understand the group's focus on investments in digital transformation. Now, as we discussed last week on this show, one of the big risks associated with digital transformation is this missing the alignment between digital transformation strategies and actually key business strategies. And Gartner reinforces this finding in their survey as well, and warns us that we all need to understand board priorities more clearly so that we can align activities investments with the enterprise's strategic direction. It's this lack of connective tissue that's really the big risk. That makes sense. So my question to everyone here today is, how can we, technology innovators and change agents, ensure that we establish this connection between digital transformation and business transformation? And what are some tips or techniques that you've seen successful in doing so? Jay, can I start with you? What about this connective tissue, and what can we do about it?
Transformation is a funny word because it means different things in different contexts. So someone who says we're going under doing a digital transformation, and the digital transformation is really upgrading a legacy system. It's not really a transformation, but we've all seen examples of we couldn't get funding to upgrade this legacy system until we called it a transformation, and now we have funding to upgrade it. Right. And so that won't be aligned to the business need if that's the case. Now you're spending transformation budget on a thing that's not really transformative on the digital side. I think we also see things on the business side where business leaders are calling things transformations that are really just getting funding to address some issues that might exist internally, some politics, some jockeying for position, and those aren't going to be supported on the digital side either. So one of the questions that we always push our customers and partners to think about when they're using the word transformation is this really a transformative program? Are we undergoing some amount of change in the organization as a result of this transformation happening? And are we aligned on the business outcome of that change? Because even in a digital transformation, the ultimate measure of it should be business impact. How are we affecting the organization? That's usually financial, not always. Sometimes there are non-financial reasons to do a transformation as well, but you are probably aiming to save cost or increase revenue as your two primary drivers. If we're all aligned on those outcomes, then we've got alignment between the business and the digital sides.
I see that we have Shreyas Becker back with us. Shreyas, are you live and with us today now?
I think I'm with you now.
There you are. Well, Shreyas, and Jonathan, I want to get to you in a second, but Shreyas, what do you think about this Gartner article that talks about the lack, perhaps, of linkage between business transformation and digital transformation, and what are some of the techniques that you've seen successful in bridging that gap?
I think it's a article right on point. A lot of times you do see too many failed projects, especially in the area that I work in, especially in AI. There is a statement that 9 out of 10 AI models never get into production. I think that's right by Gartner as well. I think there are a few steps though that you can take to prevent this gap or building this connective tissue. I think it starts right at the point of origination. For instance, that's where Jay started off as well. Hey, how do you know that this is actually solving a business problem and that this is actually transformative? And then throughout the process, how can you build, let's say, champions for different functions or different business units? Because a truly transformative program is going to touch multiple business units, which are located, sometimes in my case, across different geographies as well. So how do you build ownership across each of these business units for them to actually go drive the change? And then at every stage, how do you start measuring value and start showing incremental value? Most of the times with digital transformations, one of the reasons I've seen it fail is because leaders who actually sponsor these projects start getting a little bit pushy for results a little too earlier than the time it takes. Most of these times when people are building digital transformation, they're actually creating assets that are used across the organization. And although the creation of assets requires IP, creation of assets requires investments into infrastructure. So value creation takes time. So how do you, like, as a leader, keep communicating the process is going to be like critical as well to like the transformation journey.
All right. Now, Jonathan, you are digital transformation executive in the financial industry. What techniques have you seen that have been successful in making this linkage between digital transformation and business outcomes?
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion with all of our attendees. And I think we're seeing what's happening in that lower left box, where digital transformation is beyond just a nice to have, and it's become a must have. And if we think about what's happened since the pandemic with the shift to online experiences, the shift to real-time engagement with brands, and the expectation of a mobile-first, digitally accessible strategy for every company, we're really seeing that digital transformation isn't something that is optional for many companies these days, but it's also not a gestalt. Digital transformation is generally not a thing. They would say, okay, here's my stamp of digital transformation. At the highest levels of an organization, at the operating committee, CXO, at the board of directors, they can talk about that. But for most of the rest of us who are working in the line of business, who are in a staff function, who are at the tip of the spear facing customers, it's not about digital transformation per se. It's about how do we best serve customers? How do we center our users? How do we ensure we are delivering the value in the ways and in the places and at the times that customers expect from us? And so digital transformation becomes less about, oh, we want to do this because it's cool or because it's the next best thing, but it's driven by a need to say our users, especially in a post-pandemic world, now have an expectation that the best experience that they have across any industry, across any brand or product or service, across any app, that is now setting the baseline of what their expectation is for everyone. So it's not just about saying, how do I become best in class in my industry or in my market segment? It's how do I benchmark myself as an organization and our holistic suite of products and services and support for customers against the best in any class? And that's where we need to be looking. And of course, we're going to talk about risk and risk management and risk mitigation and things like that, which is a whole component of that digital world. But it starts with this consideration of not just how do I be best in class in my space, but how do I truly center my users?
Well, let's talk about risk. The article goes on to say that in order to drive growth today, board of directors are looking to embrace fresh approaches and technologies, but are willing to assume the risk of doing so. 46% of boards are willing to accept greater risk in expanding product lines and transforming their ways of working. 64% of board of directors expect to increase their risk appetite in 2023 and 2024. I guess overall, boards are devoting more attention to business transformation rather than technical optimization. So the upshot is that executives are willing to take on more risk in order to capture the business gains, but are also more focused than ever on reducing risk by focusing on business outcomes first, then technology. So my question to the group is, do you believe that we've entered into what the article calls a post-digital phase when it comes to this business first focus on digital transformation? Jay, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I thought post-digital was an odd choice of term, personally. I don't think we're post-digital. I think what we've got to is digital is just table stakes now. And so what you don't need to do anymore is call that out. I came up through the marketing world, and for a while, the agency that I worked at was a digital agency. And then we abandoned the word digital because all marketing became digital, and it was sort of meaningless to talk about digital marketing as opposed to non-digital marketing if it's embedded in almost everything that we do. Even out-of-home billboards have digital components where you certainly have a URL, but you may even be getting into newer technologies that are doing tracking or are doing augmented reality with it. So I think what they're trying to say was not that we've emerged on the other side of digital, which is what post-digital would suggest, but rather that digital has just become so embedded in everything we do that it's just part of the assumption when we're going forward. All transformations have some component of digital transformation to them. I think on the risk side, though, it's an interesting piece because asking a board upfront if they're comfortable with risk and taking on additional risk to expand a product line or grow revenue or whatever the case may be is different than that board actually being okay with failure, which is what will happen with some amount of risk. So if you're going to do risky things, they're not truly risky unless there's a fairly significant chance that some of them are going to fail. And you have to be comfortable with a failure rate, not just with a risky rate. I think asking the question in a leading way says, are you comfortable with some amount of risk if it results in revenue growth on the other side or a cost reduction on the other side? It's a bit different to ask the question, are you comfortable with failing at some of the things you undertake if it results in, and it may not result in that growth on the other side, hopefully it does. And so when we've looked at sort of experimenting within an organization, one of the things we've always encouraged in our own organization and with our customers and partners is consider the failure rate of experiments that you're comfortable with. And in fact, setting that failure rate high enough that you are actually trying risky things. Because if you say, well, we're comfortable with 5% of experiments failing, you're not really doing experiments. What you've told everybody is do business as usual and do safe things, but maybe push them a little bit beyond that boundary. Mm-hmm. If you say we have a minimum threshold for failed experiments of 30%, what you're telling people is, I want at least 30% of the things we undertake to fail. Now you've created an environment where people are actually pushing boundaries and are going to get those new innovations. There are risks that come with that have to be mitigated. We can't go out and introduce cybersecurity risks or crime risks or all of those other things. But if you're not setting a threshold of where you want that riskiness to be to push those boundaries, you're really just going to get more of the same plus 5%.
Interesting. I mean, the stats we explored last week on this show are more like you have a 30% chance of being successful, a 70 to 95% chance of being unsuccessful are the stats that we see from a number of large research firms. So it's interesting that the risks are still very prevalent. But Shreyas, what's your experience at Sanofi with this linkage between, or what the article calls a post-digital phase? Are we in a post-digital phase now? How are you seeing this from your perspective at Sanofi?
Mm-hmm. I don't think we are at a post-digital age. I think most of the things that we continue to do are definitely in the digital realm, so to speak. But in terms of like just talking about risk, the numbers that I have seen, Kevin, are very similar to the numbers you are mentioning. Like I would very safely say like 60 to 70% of not just projects at Sanofi, even across the digital portfolio fail. Like, like if you look at, let's say, some of the articles that, I used to work at BCG in the past, like, we continuously, repeatedly saw like 6 or 7 out of 10 projects would fail at a large scale, but you need to start defining what failure is, right? Like, is failure not adding immediate value? Is failure what exactly failure is? So I think what we are starting to see is the word terming around failure has started to change. What I mean by that is, if we build, let's say, what we call the digital backbone or the levers or enablers for digital in the future, like that terming has changed. So that's probably one of the reasons why we start seeing failure rates go down as well. And also the size of the projects are starting to shift. There is now not one big transformation effort, let's say across, let's say, the sales office or the revenue office or the marketing office. What we are starting to see is that people start setting up like a program office, and within those offices there are multiple smaller bets that are being placed. Bets could be around, hey, how do we just target like top of the funnel, or how do we target bottom of the funnel? What exactly are the levers that we could pull at each of those funnels? So I see like some of the size of the risk that people start to take have changed rapidly, because 5 years before, like when I was in consulting, for a lot of people, digital transformation in the revenue organization meant, if you're a big company, is implementing Salesforce. That's not the type of words that people use now. That's changed drastically. So that's why I see like the risk has come down. So people are reducing the size of bets, but overall the amount of money that they pump into digital has continued to gone up, and I think that's going to go up. That's why I'm also a bit hesitant to call it post-digital, because I only see investments increasing. I don't see it decreasing, at least for the next 3 to 5 years.
All right. Well, Jonathan, I want to move along and go to you now, if we could. And we've been talking about risk and how to define it. I think Shreyas makes a great point. What is our definition of failure? What are the risks? Really, how do we define their severity? So my question to you, Jonathan, is can current risk management techniques really withstand the risks posed by digital transformation technologies? And if not, what should we do about it?
Sure. I think the first thing to recognize is that risk management does not equal risk elimination. So there's always going to be a component of the risk. And what we have to do is manage and mitigate in appropriate ways while recognizing that there is just an inherent level of risk. But what is acceptable is going to vary based on industry. So, for example, I come out of the financial services world where I worked on Wall Street, and customers would not accept a program in a bank that makes your mortgage disappear or means your trades don't settle on time. So there are certain levels of acceptability of what risk is considered. But to use a couple real world examples of how we can manage and mitigate that risk when we are moving to a digital first world. So a number of years ago, I was leading development of an app. And the app was very forward thinking. It involved visuals, it involved photographs that were submitted by users. It was going to work on an omni-channel cross-platform basis. It was global in nature. And our legal and compliance teams had some concerns about this, but so did our channel partners, like the customer service teams that answer phone calls or handle inbound customer messaging through secure text. And so what we had to do was ensure that not only did we think through the technological risk management components of it from a cybersecurity standpoint, but we also had to think about what are the regulatory dynamics. We had to ensure we had accessibility. So we were thinking about how people with diverse abilities would be able to engage with and use our app. And we had to think through what might go wrong and what are the contingency plans we put in place. So for example, we encountered an experience with this app where something did go wrong. So we launched it, and it was on a number of different social media platforms. And somebody hit the wrong button at one of our vendors, and it started spamming our customers. And that was obviously a very negative situation. Because we had thought through what are the possible customer experience risks, and we had a mitigation plan in place, kind of a crisis management plan, we were able to immediately execute that within seconds. We were able to stem the problem, and we were able to remediate it and use the right messaging with customers, take the right steps where we got sign off from our management to resume the app functioning. And we were able to overcome that hiccup. Another example I would give is thinking through not just the technology risk of what if something goes wrong from like a cybersecurity standpoint, but what if something goes wrong from an operational standpoint? And the great example of this is two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication has a lot of great strengths. What happens when somebody can't access their second device? And I've experienced this personally, as I'm sure many of our viewers have as well. Let's say you lose your phone, or your phone breaks or dies or gets bricked or drops in a pond or something like that. You drop it in the ocean when you're swimming and filming your kids. So you go to get a new phone at your provider's store, and in order to activate your phone, you need to log into your account. But you can't remember your passwords because all your passwords are stored on your device with your thumbprint. But that's okay, because you can reset your password with this simple link, except the simple link requires you to log into your email, which you don't have because that was on your phone.
Okay.
So you can't reset your password. So how do you do two-factor authentication? Or another one is you go on a plane ride like I did, and you're flying cross country and you're like, great, I've got 5 hours on this plane. I'm going to watch a movie or I'm going to get some work done. So you log in with your laptop, but your work laptop is secure because it requires two-factor authentication. That's fine. You log into the airplane's Wi-Fi, which you paid for, and you have to log into your company's email system, but you can't. Why? Because the two-factor authentication is on your phone, and your phone doesn't have Wi-Fi. So you have to buy a second pass, $40 or whatever for this plane ride, just to be able to click the approve button to log in to your email, right? So what I advise our users, not our users, excuse me, what I advise our design teams when they're considering these kinds of user experience considerations is spend 20% of your time designing the happy path. Then spend 80% of your time thinking of edge cases where things can go wrong. And focus on how do we ensure we've mitigated the risks appropriately for the technology considerations and also the user experience considerations associated with all those edge cases, so we can ensure it can go right as often as possible.
So, Jonathan, you're really honing in on the customer experiences being a top driver for determining what risks may present themselves and how to respond to that. Jonathan or Jay, I wonder what your thoughts are coming from your side of things, especially when it comes to other risks like a financial risk, strategic risk that I mentioned earlier. Certainly, customer experience is a big part of that. But what would be your techniques that you would recommend? Which techniques would you choose to mitigate these kinds of risks with a digital transformation initiative?
Yeah, and I would just add to what Jonathan said about customer risk, because I think we're talking a lot about external customer risk, but a lot of the transformations that we help to orchestrate are internal transformations, and the customers are internal, and they tend to get the short stick in the sense that we just sort of assume that they will change because the company has decided to change directions. Too many of the transformation programs that we see don't have a significant enough change management component to them, where that change management is not sometimes change management gets referred to as the sort of governance of the program execution. And that's correct. You do need governance, and you need to make sure the program is executed correctly, especially in highly regulated fields like financial services or like pharma or something like that. But there's a people aspect to change management that's critical, and it gets overlooked in many of these programs and results in change fatigue or change burnout within the organizations, where people just can't keep up with the number of new things they're expected to adapt to. And that will lead to an internal failure that has a very external facing impact. Think about a call center, for example. They tend to be the end of the impact of change for a whole bunch of change programs happening internally. And now your call center reps aren't up to speed on all of these different things that have changed. Any one of those programs on its own might have been enough for them to handle, but getting hit with 3 or 4 or 5 of those at the same time. And now when people call in, your external customers, to that call center, they're not getting people who are now up to speed on everything that's changed. And so you get a very discontinuous customer experience to your external customers because you didn't manage the internal change. I'd say for all of these kinds of risks, though, the key to managing them is being transparent and open about them as you're executing those programs. So if you're in a highly political environment that doesn't reward early identification of risks and mitigation of them, where people hide those risks on their teams because they're scared to expose them, they don't want to get yelled at for having found them, then your transformation is going to fail. You can't get to the end of that and be successful without everybody having open communication about them. Our platform Conductor is built around how you orchestrate these large-scale transformations. And so how do you get that out into the open and orchestrate it in a way where those risks and issues have been identified early, that they are transparent, that people can collaborate on them, that you have a good view across a transformation, whether it's a small one or a large one, at the full set of risks that have been identified, and put in place mitigation plans for them as early as you can. Hopefully you don't need those mitigation plans and the risks don't necessarily turn into issues that need to be managed, but you've got that foresight that gives you preparedness. and you've ideally built that in a way where those mitigation plans are best practices. You've been able to assemble a library of approaches to mitigating them that have worked for your organization or your industry or company scale or geography, and you're able to redeploy those so that when a risk comes up, you can pair it with a mitigation plan early on. You know how you're going to handle it, you're monitoring and tracking it, and hopefully you mitigate and intervene early enough that the risk doesn't actually manifest as an issue down the road.
We are here today with Jay Goldman, Jonathan Alloy, and Shreyas Becker. If you have a question or a comment, please put them into the comment in the Q&A field. It's great to see the chats going on. We do have a question here from Vincent. Vincent, thank you so much for your contribution and your question today. I thought I'd send it over to Shreyas. Vincent is asking, Shreyas, which key areas would you include in an enterprise focus when revamping your digital risk framework for 2023 and beyond? Shreyas, do you have some suggestions?
Yeah, sure. I think it kind of comes down to the type of framework that you're building. I think most transformation programs, in fact, anything that you do in a company, either falls into the bucket of either making money or saving money. Like I would try to focus more on the parts that actually make money. That's where you're always going to get the more buy-in. That's where it's much easier to like get people and rally resources behind it. So within this framework, there are like different functions that you could start off look at and targeting it. There are pieces where you're always going to try and optimize existing processes to make money. These could be like, hey, I have a sales force, I want to optimize it, or I have a production, I want to optimize it or drive it. Or there could be pieces that go in like, hey, like I want to enter this new market or things like that. When you are looking at, let's say, the first piece on optimization, you have to understand that the upside is kind of capped. And when you're looking at things that are like totally greenfield, like new product line or new markets, like there is an uncapped element of, let's say, going after the value. I would typically always try and focus on balancing between these two levers, like trying to optimize a process that's fairly well known, that's ready for change, that's ready for, let's say, the investments and all of those things exist. At the same time, try to focus on, let's say, a new product launch or a new market entry. Like, striking the right balance there ensures that you're going to deliver, let's say, some value in like a quarter or 2 quarter or 3 quarter, whatever the time frame that's aligned on. But at the same time, you're building something that's visible, you're building something that people want to be a part of. And so moving the rest of the organization in that path becomes much easier. So I know I didn't give a specific answer, but that's how I would think about like going into like which areas would I focus first.
All right, very good. Well, I'd like to move on to another subject that is important to me. I hear from listeners, and the research that I do points to a difficulty that technologists have, folks that are not in the C-suite, but are the technologists, the actual change agents often in organizations, is a disconnect between folks tell me they have trouble getting a seat at the C-suite table. They may know how they need to innovate, may have even solutions that they're advocating for, both technologically and process improvement wise, that they know they need to do to innovate, but yet they lack a seat at the table and sort of an awareness, a connective tissue, again, if you will, with the C-suite. And so the trouble is collaborating with key stakeholders to not only assess your risks, but then effectively build them into your programs and get the funding and support that you need, not only for the innovation itself, but also some initiatives to reduce the risks and ensure success. So, Jonathan, what have been your successful techniques to use with key stakeholders and the C-suite to get the sort of linkage and buy-in that is needed to really innovate?
Sure. There are 3 key things that come to mind when we're talking about this. One is, just because somebody says you don't have a seat at the table doesn't mean you don't deserve to be there, or that you don't have a voice, or that you aren't deserving of being heard. So the first thing is to say, if you feel you have something to say, don't simply accept when somebody hasn't invited you. If they don't invite you to the table, find another way to communicate that message and focus on the outcomes rather than the output. So sitting at the table might be an output. That's a process piece. I'm sitting at the table. But if you think at a more abstract level, what do you really want? It's not necessarily to sit at the table. What you want is for your point of view to be heard. So think of how that outcome can be achieved. And maybe it's through allies, maybe it's through coalitions, maybe it's through surrogates. There are other ways to communicate that message, even if you personally don't have the ability to get your voice heard at that table. The second thing is put yourself in their shoes and think about what their incentive structures are. Whenever I start a conversation with someone, a negotiation, anything like that, I start by considering what is my partner actually incented to do, not just on paper, but in reality. So on paper, somebody might say, oh, yes, you're supposed to collaborate. But in reality, what you're supposed to do is manage your own P&L. And if I'm coming to you with a proposal for a collaborative exercise that I think will benefit both of us, if you perceive that may take away your ability to drive revenue for your products, you may say no, even if you agree with me. Because the actual incentives for your company, what your job and your bonus and your salary and your success depend on, is not collaborating with me. It's actually on driving your own P&L. So make sure you start by thinking about what are the actual incentive structures that you're going to be working on. And then the third thing is to know your partner's business as well as your own. And in financial services, so I was working on the technology side. So I have to know the technology. I have to know Agile. I have to know design thinking. I have to know all the pieces associated with my profession and my function. But I also have to know what are my businesses' processes and functions, and what are their customers' processes and functions. And I have to be able to speak their language. So I'm explaining my work without technology jargon. I'm explaining it in business terms. I'm quantifying it. I'm speaking their language and putting it in terms that are relevant to them. I'm not going to assume that just because I think something is important, that they're going to agree with me. So even while I'm building a point solution for technology, I'm thinking holistically about that end-to-end customer experience, that end-to-end risk management program, and I'm framing it using language and using data that support how they make decisions. And I don't think that I'm minimizing myself by doing it. It makes me think I'm a really good communicator when I am able to articulate to somebody else why I think this is important to them and get them to agree with me. Because ultimately, again, if we focus on outcomes rather than outputs, if the nature of the problem is I don't have a seat at that table, I'm going to look for all the different ways I can get my message across. And over time, I may or may not earn my way to a seat at that particular table. I might go get my own table. I might leave the company. There's 1,000 things I can do. But what we don't want to do is say, oh, well, because I'm not invited to the table, I'm just going to sit back and watch the world burn. We don't want to do that.
Jay, what is your take on how we can better collaborate with key stakeholders to assess the risks of our digital transformation effort?
I think there's a perception sometimes, and Jonathan was speaking to this, that I have to go up to go across. That's not necessarily true. So if you can't get that seat at the C-suite table, maybe you can go direct to the folks in another part of the organization that you need to collaborate with, identify those risks that you share, and then be proactive about being on top of that, even without that C-suite buy-in. I think also there's often, and especially when we're talking about larger and larger companies, this need to get sign off, obviously from a budget perspective, but approval to go ahead with something. And what we actually see as more successful is you're trying to take on too large a program and get approval to go ahead with it. You may be much more successful looking for that lower hanging fruit that's easier to pick. So can I start off by building some momentum and some success on the things I don't need to go up to get approval to do? Are there things I can do within just my own immediate team where I don't even need to go across? And then can I go to the teams immediately next to mine and get some success? And by building that momentum before you seek that C-suite or executive sign off, you're going to them not with a set of problems that need to be solved, but with some proven success at transforming things. And success builds success. So if you can go and say, hey, look, we've run a couple of small projects. We've been really successful just inside our own team. Then we collaborated with the teams around us and we were really successful at doing those. Now we'd like to take on this much bigger program. You have a much higher chance of getting approval for that than if you had just gone in with that bigger program to start off with.
And Shreyas, what has been your experience at Sanofi collaborating with stakeholders, especially when it comes to assessing risks and making a mitigation plan?
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's a good question. I kind of want to go back to some of the things Jonathan was saying as well. I think a lot of it kind of boils down to hey, can I think like a sales guy? That's basically what it's all about. Can you align your objective to org objectives? Can you then be able to efficiently navigate the organization and whatever is it that you're selling? If it's a small piece that you're selling, if it's a big piece that you're selling, can you ensure that the right people have the buy-in based on your understanding of the org, and if it's aligned with the overall message that the organization is trying to drive? There are many tactical ways in which you could do that, but then in just coming down to what you spoke about, just identifying the risk and the mitigation. In my world, most of the risk, 99% of the time, is, hey, I don't know if the data is going to exist. I don't know if I can get the right people to build this. Talent is 99% of the time the blocker for us. So how do I kind of mitigate the talent? That's always something, it requires long-term investments, working with universities, getting the right let's say the people to work with in terms of training and coaching. People use the words agile, but sometimes it's some of those soft skills like agile or design thinking. Sometimes it's just the hard skills, can I get React developers? Can I get the right backend engineers? Can I get the right front-end engineers? That's usually how the risk kind of boils down in reality, at least in my world. I work in a business where the margins are pretty big, so we don't have a big cost pressure or a price pressure like some of the other businesses have. But getting the right people, having the right infrastructure elements in place, they are always the big risk. And both of these take a long-term kind of strategy to mitigate for those risks.
All right, very good. We do have some questions coming in. This one from Rebecca. In addition to continuous monitoring and reviewing of the digital risk framework, what other tools could be employed systematically to identify and manage evolving digital risk? I'll open that up to all three of you, gentlemen. Anyone have a thought on Rebecca's question about evolving digital risk?
Well, I'll chime in and I'll say I think that regardless of the industry we're in, the number one risk right now overall is disruption. The risk is moving too slow, not moving too fast. So thinking about what your position is in the industry against not just current competitors, but what startups are out there who see a profitable slice of your market space and think that they can access that ahead of you. It's a classic innovator's dilemma, or an only the paranoid survive type of thing. But
Right.
Every day we should be thinking about how can we cannibalize ourselves? How can we outcompete ourselves before somebody disrupts us? And that's the number one risk I think every industry is facing.
All right, we are here with Jay Goldman, Jonathan Alloy, and Shreyas Becker. We've been talking about mitigating risk with digital transformation. Gentlemen, in just the few minutes that we have left, I'd like to ask each of you if you could please provide us with one quick action item that our attendees can use to start taking advantage of the ideas and advice that we've talked about today. So I'd like to start with Jay, if I could. Jay, 60 seconds. What's your action item for our audience today?
Think about transformation as having to deliver business outcomes, and how you frame this in measuring success that will lead to that business outcome, and look for your leading indicators that will show you that you're on track, not just your lagging indicators that you can look at when the process is finished.
Very good. That is Jay Goldman. Shreyas Becker, please, what is your action item for us? 60 seconds. What's a good action item that you can leave us with today?
Understand your, let's say, the fundamental component of your role, and try to isolate the pain point of your role. If you can solve for that problem that you have in your role with a digital tool, or build a tool to solve that, that is something that would scale and become a big transformation effort. So in essence, start small, that's meaningful, and then try to find a way to scale it.
Thank you, Shreyas. All right, Jonathan, your action item for us today?
The number one thing I think we should all be doing is centering users. And if we center users, that will give us the wherewithal to look at incentive structures, to think about outcomes ahead of outputs, to consider the market and how we might be disrupted, and to think not just best in our own class, but best overall. So it all comes down to centering users.
All right, very good. That is Jonathan Alloy, Shreyas Becker, and Jay Goldman. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being a great panel today. And thanks everyone out there for being with us today. We couldn't do it without you. Please join us next week again, Tuesday at 1600 GMT, when we talk with another great panel of experts. Next time about why businesses need a digital transformation leader. It should be another great discussion. And if you'd like to find me, you can do so at LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect there. And check me out on my weekly business audio podcast called the Digital Transformation Podcast. But with all of that said, and for now, that will do it for this episode of Digital Transformation Talk. Until next week, I'm Kevin Crane. Thank you for watching.